So Izuku has finally returned to take on Shigaraki, and it's been a long time coming because I think the last time that we saw Izuku was like in June, which was at the end of chapter 357, when we saw that he was still making his way to UA by flying using a combination of his multiple quirks. And this is because at the beginning of the arc, he was like grabbed by Toga as the individual teams were being warped to their specific locations. And he was kind of stuck with that group for a little bit, but eventually he was able to break away from it with the help of Uraraka and Tsuyu, and he started to make his way back to UA because he was originally supposed to be a part of the team that was taking on Shigaraki in the first place. But as he was getting there, he was complaining about not being fast enough. And that brings us to the end of chapter 357, where we saw the vestige of Yoichi, the first user of One for All, appear and say, "Midoriya, I've got a bad feeling about this." And we saw like these things approaching Izuku. And at the time we didn't know what they were. Now we know what was going on, because in the distance behind Izuku arriving at UA here, as he's encountering Shigaraki, we see the jets of Star and Stripes' team. So that means that those things that were approaching Izuku in chapter 357 were these jets, which means that they found Izuku and then pretty much escorted him all the way back to UA, getting him there much faster than he would have gotten with his own abilities. Hey, also guys, if you like my Hero content, please subscribe if you haven't already. It's fine if you don't want to, but if you just need a reminder, here you go. Thanks. And now that Izuku's finally here, he's going to be taking on Shigaraki in his alleged final form or apex form. I don't think this is the peak of him. Maybe it is for Shigaraki individually, but it remains to be seen for All for One or the All for One / Shigaraki consciousness once it's fully been assimilated, which I assume is going to happen after the whole All for One versus Endeavor and Hawk stuff wraps up. But it's explained in this chapter why Shigaraki is going into this form, and of course it's due to the alterations that Yujiko had performed on Shigaraki's body so that he was strong enough to be able to utilize the full power of All for One. Like, the quirk itself has just become too strong and it needs like this special type of body to harness it. And due to his quirks being erased by Aizawa and Aoyama, he wasn't able to use regeneration for like the longest time, and he's accumulated a lot of damage in this battle as well. On top of that, he's had a bunch of mental stress and it drove Shigaraki to the brink, and at this point his body is evolved into its apex form, perfectly crafted to deal with the threats he faced. And I gotta say, this looks really cool. It's like the super final form version of what we originally saw of Shigaraki when we were introduced to him, you know, when he used to wear the hands of his deceased family members. And speaking of them, they're now like the fingers of like this giant arm that he has. He's pretty much like in a condensed form of what we've been seeing these last couple chapters, where he's just been flooding the entire area with just his flesh and fingers and everything. And now that he's acquired this form, he's not playing around anymore, and he just one-shots Mirko, Tamaki, and Nejiri in order. And he doesn't even look at Mirio while this is happening. He's like, "I know just how powerless you are." And that's pretty much true, because while Mirio has an awesome quirk with permeation, he doesn't really have anything to capitalize on it with that. I mean, against a normal villain he would, of course, but Shigaraki is obviously the strongest of the strong, and unless you have like One for All type strength or something that rivals that, there's pretty much nothing you can do against him. Then we see Shigaraki like try to go after Best Jeanist and Bakugo, and he's like, you know, "Don't fix what someone broke," referencing when he originally killed Bakugo by piercing his heart. And speaking of that, we're not getting an update on what's going on with Bakugo. Like, he's still laying there. And we saw in the previous chapters that Best Jeanist had like stitched up his heart, and we saw that Edgeshot use like his ultimate ability to like repair Bakugo's heart and lungs, but also like become them at the same time. And I'm assuming that he's definitely going to come back to life, but we're just not seeing it happen yet. Like, I for sure see him fighting side by side with Izuku at some point. But not even Best Jeanist is able to contain Shigaraki because he's just too much of a beast now. Until suddenly Mandalay starts contacting everyone, and she's like, "We need to lift the electromagnetic barrier just for a moment. It'll take 2 seconds, so please hold on somehow." And this is of course because she's opening it for Izuku to arrive, although at this point in the chapter we don't know that yet. Best Jeanist is like, 2 seconds is way too long, because, you know, this is battle manga and they're much slower than the seconds in our reality. But Mirio is like having an existential crisis at this point, after what Shigaraki had told him about just, you know, realizing how powerless he is. And he starts remembering like what Night Eye had told him before he died, where a society without cheer and humor will not have a bright future. And Mirio takes that quite literally and comes in front of Shigaraki and says, "Hey you, check out this peach," and shows him his butt. Yeah, this happens. This is what Mirio has been reduced to. And when I first saw this page, I was like, this reminds me of like Naruto humor. And then I remembered, oh wait, this is straight up a sequence out of Naruto as well, because at the end of that series, when they're taking on Kaguya, Naruto does like the reverse harem jutsu to her, and he distracts her the same way that Shigaraki is being distracted by Mirio's butt here. And Naruto, it was enough for him to get a clean strike on Kaguya, and here it's enough for Izuku to come back in and land a strike as well. But first he uses like black whips to like slingshot himself, which we've seen him use before, but this panel is just amazing. And he successfully smashes Shigaraki here at the end of the chapter. And this is where things are really going to start getting interesting, because we haven't really seen anybody strong enough to take on Shigaraki in his new form yet. And that's kind of like what the series has come to. Like, the power creep has gotten so crazy that Izuku is the only one who can take on Shigaraki. Like, before it was more feasible with like Aizawa shutting down quirks and whatnot, but as we've seen, it's not enough because his body is just too powerful even without the use of quirks. So now that Izuku is here, who allegedly has unlocked all of his quirks, even the second users, which we haven't seen him use yet, but he claims that he can use it, along with being able to use 100%. And even if he doesn't need to like fully go 100%, he could still use the faux 100%, which he may have used in his entrance here with the slingshot and the Fajin quirk, although it's not stated. But I don't know if this is necessarily like the beginning of the final fight of the series, but it's certainly taking us in that direction for sure. Because like I said, All For One hasn't like fully assimilated into Shigaraki yet, and I think that's going to be a big turning point. And like I also mentioned in my spoilers video yesterday, there's still a lot of stuff that we haven't touched on yet, like with the other students and their individual fights, and I think Horikoshi might cut away from this maybe in the next few chapters or so, and then we're just going to be focusing on that stuff for a little bit, and then we'll come back to what's going on with Izuku taking on Shigaraki here. So at the end of the previous chapter, we saw Izuku finally come back to UA to take on Shigaraki, and in this chapter it's revealed, or should I say confirmed, that he was assisted by Star and Stripes pilot friends who took him there on their jets. And once he showed up, he like quickly smashed Shigaraki in a pretty cool sequence, and afterwards Shigaraki says, is he even stronger than before? This is in reference to when they had fought in the previous war, of course, and he says that glow around him, just like the third. He's talking about the third user's Fajin quirk, of course, which allows Izuku to build up kinetic energy and release it, and we saw him do this as soon as he got there, in combination with like slingshotting himself off of those poles with a black whip quirk as well. This is like his faux 100% move that he does. And I guess this is like the All For One portion of the consciousness here that is saying this, because only All For One would know the third user of One For All, because he fought him like a long time ago. I guess like almost 100 years, because it's the second and the third user of One For All that were like the spearheads of that uprising against All For One like back in the day. And after Izuku knocked Shigaraki / All For One away with this smash, he looks around the battlefield and he sees that everyone looks like they're dead and or dying. And he notices that Bakugo is like the most dead looking there with the All Might card next to him. And this is because Bakugo is still like technically dead right now, I guess, right? And naturally, Izuku seeing this, he's going to like freak out, and Shigaraki / All For One is like further trying to egg him on, because that's what he ultimately wanted here. That's why he went after Bakugo in the first place, because he wanted Izuku to go into like his freak out rage mode, because he saw him do this in the previous war when they had fought. Like when he stabbed Bakugo through the stomach in this chapter, he says in this state of rage his movements are bound to be overly hasty and predictable. A well-placed counterattack should break his spine in two. So like I said, he's trying to use this to his advantage to ultimately defeat Izuku and eventually take One For All from him. And Izuku does freak out big time and goes back into that rage mode. He's even like biting onto one of his black whips. This is like a pretty emotional panel here. It looks great. But before he can like completely explode, Mirio shows up and he's like, it's all right, Deku. It'll be fine. Everyone's still breathing. Right now, Edshot is saving Bakugo's life from inside of him. So yeah, I guess that means that Bakugo is still kind of dead, I guess. But I guess this also means that Edshot hasn't completed his his ultimate ability surgery thing that he's doing, where he like condenses himself into all of these strings, and he's going to go inside of Bakugo's chest, heal the damaged portions of his heart and lungs while also becoming them, but then on top of that giving him like internal CPR, all of this at the cost of his own life, of course. And considering the state that we see Bakugo in and what Mirio's saying here, I guess it still hasn't completed yet. But then after like a little back and forth between All For One and Mirio, Mirio's words are enough to make Izuku remember things that people have told him throughout his life, such as like All Might and Star and Stripes pilots. But then he also remembers what Banjo, the 5th user of One For All, had told him, where it's like it's okay to be angry. The vital thing to do is keep your emotions under control. And this, of course, in reference to when he had first met Banjo in the Vestige world, when he told him like, listen, when you use this power out of anger, it'll really start working for you. What really matters is controlling your heart. It's okay to get mad. That rage can be the source, but in the meantime, you gotta control it better. And that's essentially what Izuku is doing here. Because after he remembers these things and what Mirio had just said, and he reverts back to a calmer, more serious Izuku. And I guess that's how he's going to be going forward here. And this is the best way to utilize One For All. But after Izuku calms down, we come to the final page of the chapter where he says, All For One, is Shigaraki still there? And this is an awesome panel. I really like this one, where we see him using Black Whip as like a scarf, staring down Shigaraki / All For One with all of the vestiges behind him. Like, this is pretty cool stuff. But also, in my opinion, this is kind of setting up the end game of this arc / fight, I suppose, because him asking All For One if Shigaraki is still in there is how this is pretty much going to conclude. And I think it was set up in chapter 305 as well, because if we go back to that chapter, we see Izuku in the Vestige world speaking to all of the previous users of One For All, and Nana asks him, like, will you have the resolve to kill Shigaraki if that's what it takes? And Izuku says, I could see he was hurting, or rather I could feel it. When Shigaraki's consciousness invaded One For All, when he was focusing so hard on his dream, I felt it inside, all that rage. I felt a little boy crying. And then we see like this vision of little Izuku walking up to like little Tenko. And then he says, One For All is a power meant for saving, not killing. Maybe there's no other way besides killing. And I don't know what I'm going to do when the time comes, but I want to save that little boy. And like I said, that's pretty much setting up what's going to happen, because it also correlates with what we've been seeing happening inside of Shigaraki / All For One for like the last 30 something chapters or so. We've seen like there's this offshoot of Tenko's consciousness inside there as well. We have like the Shigaraki consciousness, the All For One consciousness, but now there's like Tenko, and he's being bound by like all of these hands. And he also originally called out to Izuku saying that he was a true hero. So what I'm assuming is going to happen here is some way or another, Izuku is going to break through to that Tenko consciousness, and I guess it's going to break out of those hands that are holding him back, and he'll eventually become the dominant personality here. And what's going to happen after that, you know, with Tenko being inside of this monstrous body that he has become, not really sure. I mean, it's possible that he could just morph back to being Tenko again, because, you know, it was established in the previous chapter that Shigaraki's body can like modify itself to the specific situation that it's in and whatever the ideal form requires. And in theory, if Tenko takes over, then maybe it could just morph back to being Tenko, you know, possibly. I mean, it's not going to completely erase the fact that he is still this crazy Quirk singularity monstrosity, but I don't know, it's something, I guess. Or Eri shows up randomly and then just rewinds him. I mean, that's always a possibility too. Some way or another, Izuku is going to break through to the Tenko consciousness, and I think that's how this will ultimately end. Alright, so in this chapter, Izuku's final quirk is finally revealed. And of course, as we knew, it was going to be the second user of One For All's quirk. But it's not what we expected at all, or at least not what I expected, because whenever we saw the second user, he had like these cannons on his arms, and he looked similar to Bakugo, and that opened up a whole other can of worms, which is closed now, but it made us think for the most part that it was going to be some kind of like laser, energy, or projectile type of quirk, but it turns out that it's not that at all, because the name of his quirk is called Transmission, and its ability enables the user to shift the speed of anything he touches. So yeah, that's pretty cool and really powerful actually, because as we'll see in this chapter, there's crazy applications to this ability and it's very versatile and it becomes overpowered very fast. So at first Izuku actually just uses this on himself, like that's just like the base application of it, because we see him touching his hand as he says transmission second, and then suddenly he's just way faster than what he originally was. And of course he was already incredibly fast, because in this sequence he is in fact in 100% of One For All, and of course he could use this in combination with Fa Jin, the kinetic energy build up and release quirk, and if he does all three together, then I assume he has to be surpassing the speed of Prime All Might at that point. I know that's a little taboo to say, especially to some of you, but considering that we're at the end of the series here, he has to surpass him in some regard at some point, right? But he winds up moving so fast that he instantly connects with All For One here, and he says second gear, and then he hits him again and says third gear. So this is incredible and problematic, but let's first talk about the incredibleness. So Izuku has already altered his own speed by touching himself, as we established, but once he's hitting All For One, after making impact with him, he is now altering All For One speed as well. So he's moving ultra fast, hitting All For One with the incredible strength that he has, but now All For One is going to move even faster than what he originally was after being touched by transmission. And he can incrementally increase the speed as well, because we see second gear, then third gear with the follow-up strike. And it ultimately ends with top gear, where we see him hitting All For One in a similar fashion that All Might hits the USJ Nomu in the anime. And he winds up sending him so incredibly fast at this point that even Mirio's like, the sound is delayed. So yeah, this is great actually, and I'm really surprised that Horikoshi was able to pull this off in the way that he did, because while an energy projectile or whatever type of quirk would have been cool, it would have been pretty cliche, because that's, you know, typically what it can come down to sooner or later with these shonen battle manga power-ups, of course. But this is subverting my expectations in a great way. Like, this is such a cool ability. Let's get into the issue with this, and it's the naming of it. Second gear, third gear. This is Luffy's thing. I mean, you don't even really have to be that much into One Piece to know that this is iconic to Luffy. And not only that, but at least when Luffy activates second gear and fourth gear, he alters his speed in a very similar way to Izuku here. So with that being said, I assume that Viz, the official translation of this on Sunday, is going to change it for sure, because if they don't, it's kind of a bad look for Horikoshi in my opinion. Because like I said, this is Luffy's thing, and I'm pretty sure the entire fandom is going to realize that immediately. I mean, more so the Japanese, and they're going to be like, you know, what are you doing? But anyway, after he hits him with the top gear and sends him like All Might sent the USJ Nomu, All For One's like, what just happened? This is completely different from that glow that he was using before, referring to Fa Jin. He's too fast. Don't tell me that. And then the second user interjects and he says, things are different this time around, All For One. And I guess this is All For One speaking, where he says a meta ability that enables the user to shift the speed of anything he touches. And I say that because he calls it a meta ability. This is what people originally called quirks, like once they first came around, like around 100 years ago or so. And that was the same time that the second user was around and fighting against All For One, because he was a part of that initial resistance against him. And this also explains why All For One got triggered by Bakugo and was reminded of the second user, because after Bakugo had activated his cluster ability, he essentially started to mimic transmission here, because his speed radically altered as well. When he allowed multiple explosions to come out of all of the pores on his body, he moved and accelerated in a similar way that Izuku is here, and he wound up hitting All For One in a similar fashion that reminded him of this quirk, and which led him to feel threatened. And also, speaking of the second user's quirk back in the day, going back to what we were saying about how he was wearing those gauntlets, makes me wonder, like, there has to be a reason why he was wearing those, right? And it's possible that they were just weapons that he used, like it was like a laser cannon or something like that. But it's also possible that now that we know the full extent of his ability, which is made more clear here than it was yesterday with the spoilers, it's possible that he was touching whatever was inside of those gauntlets and he was able to shoot them out of it way faster than what they typically would be. And I think that's probably what he was doing with those things. It's up in the air what he was firing out of them, of course, but I wouldn't be surprised at this point if Horikoshi just never touches on that and we never really find out what he was doing with those. Then coming to the end of the chapter here, Izuku goes into Gearshift overdrive, which I guess is the ultimate of this possibly, because obviously it's going above top gear. And with the second user saying things are different this time around One For All, meaning that, you know, second user probably couldn't go this far with the quirk, because he also told Izuku a couple chapters back that like, hey, this quirk is different now because it's been strengthened by One For All. Wasn't as strong back in the day when I had it. And then in the final 2 pages here, we see Yoichi, the first user, come out and he says, to put it into Izuku Midoriya's words, 100% becomes 120. And we see Izuku Detroit smash All For One, like right in the solar plexus, like beyond full power here, because he says 100% becomes 120. So this is amazing, going beyond his limits. And I guess this is a better way of showing what Izuku did to Muscular way back when he went against him and we got the whole infamous 1,000,000% sequence. And at the time, of course, we knew that he wasn't literally using 1,000,000% of One For All. It was just a hyperbolic sequence to make it more exciting, but it just basically indicated that he was going above 100% of One For All at that point, which essentially he is doing here. But at this point, he's able to maintain it rather than just do it in one single strike. Of course, with the assistance of the upgraded transmission quirk. So yeah, this is really exciting. And Izuku is, you know, near God level at this point, if not straight up on it, because as we know, All For One's quirks are being shut down by Monoma and Aizawa, and without them, he's just going to get destroyed by Izuku here, and it's definitely not going to be that easy. Like, something is going to happen, he's going to get his quirks back, or Izuku's going to run out of juice or something, because also that could play into the 5-minute time limit that the second user mentions in this chapter, where he says if we don't deal with him in the next 5 minutes, this world is doomed. So that could either mean that, you know, we're in the final sequence here, and this battle is only going to last 5 more minutes, 5 battle manga minutes, of course, which is like 5 hours in our reality. But it could also mean that Izuku might gas out in 5 minutes, and then we're going to go into this whole big sequence where Izuku has to dig deep again and come back and ultimately finish him off. So this chapter is amazing. We're finally getting to see Izuku using all 7 of his quirks at once, and it does not disappoint. Like, this is one of the best chapters with one of the best sequences in the entire series. And it's picking up with us seeing Izuku just destroying Shigaraki, like coming off at the end of the previous chapter, where he just is smashing him into the ground here. But we're getting more insight into his final quirk here, which is the second user's quirk, and it was revealed in the previous chapter that it's called Gearshift. And we knew that he could alter the speed of things that he touched, but it's actually more nuanced than that, because it had become so strong by being amplified by One For All over the years. He can now alter the speed of each and every cell in his body. So that means, like, when he touches himself and activates the quirk to alter his speed, it's not like he's just overall just altering his body. He's individually targeting every single cell. So the speed of every single cell in his body is being altered. And he's become so unbelievably powerful and fast with this that going further, it says when the raw stored up power of One For All, like the stockpiler aspect of it, overlaps with Gearshift, the smash that he delivers packs enough power to bend even the laws of physics. And then we see him hit All For One with a quintuple smash, meaning that he's hitting him so incredibly fast that it appears that he has hit him with 5 consecutive smashes all at once. Like, I picture this happening in a similar way that we see Boros hitting Saitama at the end of season 1 of One Punch Man. And this isn't even the peak of Izuku bending the laws of physics here, because after he quintuple smashes Shigaraki here, he immediately follows up and charges at him again. And All For One's like, even if my eyes can't keep up, I can predict his next attack based on the angle and the timing of the previous one. So Izuku's moving so fast here that All For One can't even keep up with him anymore. But he can kind of predict where he's going. So we see him just like blindly counter where he assumes that Izuku's going to be, but he's not there because Izuku just stops midair And we see him activate low gear this time. And the second user says this quirk, Gearshift, can change your speed while ignoring inertia. So that's just like blowing my mind here, because, you know, something in motion has to kind of just slow down to come to a stop, right? It can't just instantly stop like that. Well, in this case, Izuku can, because we saw him use Gearshift to increase his speed before, you know, like second gear, third gear, and etc. But he can also go into low gear where he just stops moving completely. No slowdown, just instantly stopping, ignoring inertia, which goes back to him bending the laws of physics here. And then All For One tries to hit him again, but then suddenly like a smoke screen appears. And this sends us into the best sequence of this chapter and one of the best sequences in the series. And it's because in this sequence, Izuku is going to use all of his quirks all at once, all synergistically working together, and it's just incredible. So first we saw him activate the smoke screen, which is the 6 user's quirk. This is shielding himself from All For One's visibility, of course, but also at the same time he can't see All For One because he's in the smoke screen. However, that doesn't really matter because he goes on to use the 4th user's danger sense quirk, so he can pinpoint the exact location of All For One through the smoke screen despite not seeing him. Then using the 7th user, Nana's quirk, Float, he flies up in the air to get the high ground above him. Then he uses the 5th user's quirk, Black Whip, and grabs him, pulls him up into the air with him. And then we see that he has stored up power from using that quintuple smash on him earlier, and now he has enough kinetic energy to go to the next sequence. And this is of course the 3rd user's Jin quirk. And then finally he activates Gearshift again and just immediately goes into like its final phase, which is overdrive. And then we just see him launching at All For One here with all of the vestiges behind him, and just this incredible panel, just an incredible sequence. Like I said, finally using all 7 of his quirks at once here, all synergistically working together, and it's just amazing. And Izuku's also like, this time I'm not holding anything back. And we see him almost go into that like full-blown rage mode, but then he's able to control himself and his pupils come back. This goes back to a couple chapters ago when he saw Bakugo nearly dead and he almost completely lost control of himself, but then he remembered what the 5th user and All Might were telling him about how, you know, you need to control your emotions. It's okay to use your rage and anger because that can amplify One For All, but you need to be able to control it, because if you lose yourself, then it's a detriment. And we see him like controlling his rage here, which is just bringing him to like the full apex of his power, at least for now. I assume he'll get stronger than this towards the very end of the series. And he winds up just hitting All For One so incredibly hard that like he's cracking his stomach and just blowing all of these pieces off of him. Like he's hit him so hard here that he's pretty much down for the count right now. And afterwards the 2nd user is like, this is where the going gets tough, kid. Remember what Shimura said, don't go collapsing on me now. So I think this is foreshadowing for sure, and it goes back to what the 2nd user also said in the previous chapter, where he was like, we only have 5 minutes to defeat Shigaraki, or else the world is doomed, essentially. And I guess that means that once he activates Gearshift and, you know, starts altering the speed of his cells in his body, he only has about 5 minutes to do this because it's so exhausting on him that he's eventually going to pass out. The 2nd user also alluded to this a while ago when we first got a hint of his quirk, when he said, I thought I told you that it was meant to be your last resort. So yeah, I think we are going to get to that point, and Izuku is going to pass out eventually from using this, but he's not going to be able to defeat All For One in time. And another thing that makes me think that is what's said by All For One in this next sequence here, where as he's falling, he says, I haven't even used a single quirk yet. I haven't been able to show the true power of this body. It's their fault, that wretched Eraserhead and those brats. And I've also been confined in this coffin. And that's very true. Like as soon as this battle started, they were like immediately erasing his quirks, and we haven't seen anything from him yet, only just him using his modified quirk singularity body. So I'm assuming that Izuku is going to get to that breaking point. He is going to pass out, and then something's going to happen as to where All For One can finally use all of his quirks and everything, and we see his true power. And I'll get into what I think that is, because afterwards we see like these 9 lights appear behind All For One as he starts freaking out after he said that. And I'm not really sure what these lights are. They do look similar to what like the One For All lights are when we saw them like tapping into the Vestige's power before, but I don't think that's necessarily what it's paralleling to. Maybe I think this more so represents the allies that he has left, maybe, because afterwards he says, Yoichi, if everything I've done until now decides whether I win or lose, not yet, then I've still got a chance. And then we see Spinner, and the narration says it's all been left to Spinner. So this is like really interesting, because I think this is giving us insight into what is going to happen possibly, which is going to lead to All For One potentially turning the tables here, because the last time we saw Spinner was in chapter 353, and he's all big and giant like this now because All For One had given him like this giant quirk on top of the quirk that he already had, the Gecko quirk, before the war had started. And we saw that Spinner was like with the heteromorphic army that he's like controlling right now in his portion of the war, and he was taking on like Shoji and the other heroes with him. And Spinner said, they locked up Kurogiri, but we're taking him back in order to destroy the status quo, for Shigaraki's sake, for our sake, to demolish the system that oppressed us. So I think all this means that maybe Spinner and his group is actually going to like get Kurogiri back. Like they're going to break him out from where he is, and then they're going to use his quirk to like warp to UA, like inside of the coffin where they are right now. And then I guess he's either going to bring everyone with him and take out Aizawa and Monoma that way, or they're just going to warp All For One out of there. And then once he's outside of that, he won't be erased anymore, and then he can just fully use his quirks, and then it's just, you know, pretty much chaos at that point. So I assume that this is probably where things are headed at this point. But let me know what you think is going to happen, and what do you think about Izuku possibly passing out here eventually? Let me know. And if you liked the video, guys, please give it a like. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.